Good morning, everyone. By the way, I'm Merlin Serentas. So, my topic for this morning is all about writing genres, or there are many styles of creative writing. So, by the way, what is genre? Genre is a category of artistic composition, as in music or literature, characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. That is the meaning of genre. Next, there are types of genres. First is the genres of form. When you say genres of form, genre corresponds um, bothly to the intellectual content of what is being described. For example, almanacs, dispositions, plays, at poems. So those are the genres of form. And then form means is corresponds with physical characteristics. For example, embroidered bindings, imposition errors, manicules, and samil bands. Those are the examples of form. Okay, so the types of genres, they are genres of form. Example: poetry, fiction, and plays. Other types of genres is um, genres of subject like fantasy, science fiction, and romance. Next, fiction. When we say fiction, means literature in the form of prose, especially short stories and novels that describes imaginary events and people. So when you say fiction, that is the meaning of or meaning that the form of prose. For example, a some of the fiction like the short stories and novels, those are the example of fiction. And another thing is fiction form as a narrative or story. So when you say narrative, so when you read a story, as you observe that there are in the story there are characters, setting, and the plot of the story. So in fiction can form of short stories. So when you write, if you are a writer, when you write a your own stories, you can write a few pages for to 40 pages. For flash fiction, a paragraph to a page, and also the novellas 50 to 100 pages, and novel 200 to 600 pages. Those are the forms when you are narrate your story. Okay, next is the corresponding to fiction. Corresponding, so after you um, reading the story, so there are the questions that we ask while you are reading the fiction. For example, who is the story about? So, who tell the story? Or what is interesting visually or emotionally? So, when you read the story, so who is the story talking about? And what kind of the interesting that you like, and what the story that you are visualize, or if you are emotionally to describe your story. So where does the story take place, or that is the setting? And then what is conflict within the story? The nature of the conflict. So those are the responding to fiction. And then the last another question is, what's different on the last page from the first page? What has changed? So those are the question that you will ask after you reading the fiction. And the last question is, so what? What makes you care about what happens to these characters? So those are the question about how to respond after you reading. Okay, that is the important of while you are reading the story. Okay, next is creative nonfiction. We say creative nonfiction using the conventions of fiction to tell a true story. So this is the nonfiction. And next is letting the reader see the story instead of summarizing, reporting, analyzing, or explaining. So in the creative uh, nonfiction, or so the reader, let the reader to research some important details when you read the story. And then there are two subcategories of creative nonfiction. First is the memoir. When you say memoir, is a specific genre within the bounds of written work. There are many examples of memoirs which are very famous. The common examples of memoir are Henry David Thoreau's Walden, and another examples of memoir is Elie Wiesel's Night. So those are the examples of memoir. Next is research creative nonfiction. When you say research creative nonfiction, is the emotions are physical types that have little to do with the words we use to label them. Language plays and rule in emotion because language supports the conceptual knowledge uh, with the with make meaning of emotions, sensations from the body or world in a given context. So those are the research creative nonfiction. In nonfiction, that is the to tell a true story. So we need to research. We need um, we need to research some deep meaning of the story. What is the story is all about, and then there are responding to creative nonfiction. What are the questions to ask while reading creative nonfiction? So first, what is interesting or visually emotionally? So when you read the true story, what those interesting that you read. So if you want to read the nonfiction, of course you need to imagine or you need to visualize of what the story is all about. And if the story is very emotionally, so sometimes when you read the uh, nonfiction story, so there are times that when you read the story, it felt like the we are emotionally too, you feel you are feel connected when you read. Okay, and then next is, who is the story about? How do you come to know the people in the piece? So did you when you read the story, there are many characters that we read in that story, in the particular of the story, and where does the story take place, or that is the setting of the story, and what is the conflict within the story. So in the story, when you read the story, there is a conflict. So the climax of the story, and what information do you learn, what insight do you gain. So in that story that you read, so there are a lot of insights that you gain of what we have learned that story that you read. So there are story that or the moral story. When I read some articles, for example, in the moral story, I like to read the moral story because there are some um, insights that I learn those stories that I read. What's different on the last page from the first page? What has changed? So as a reader, we need to be observant of what is happening. Okay, last, so what makes you care about what happens these characters. So as a readers, there are times that you are excited to read, and at the end, so you are excited what is happening in this story. Okay. Next is poetry. Poetry and compressed. When you say compressed, yes, should be shorter, certain the important content from the original and itself be grammatical. That is a poetry. And another thing is rich with language and emotion. Last, I mentioned this last topic that in rich with language and emotion, uh, the language plays and ruled in emotion because language supports the conceptual knowledge with to make meaning of sensations from the body. So in a poetry, there are the body language, there are imagery when you read a poetry. Then there are two basic types of poetry. The narrative, when you say narrative, uses character, conflict, and story. When you say lyric, presents a brief, concentrated feeling or emotion. When you read a poem, so when you feel a, there is a feeling, okay, when you read a poem. Next is prose poems. Prose poems is poetry written in prose form instead of verse form while preserving poetic qualities such as heightened imagery, parataxes, and emotional effects. In prose poems, there are, when you write prose poems, written block type, usually 1 to 2 paragraphs. So as you observe that there are a lot of prose poems in the internet. As you observe that 1 to 2 paragraphs only looks like prose but read like a poem. Okay, that is a prose. And then maybe strange, surprising, or surreal situation. It depends of what you read. It depends what you read the prose. If is emotionally, you can act emotionally. If the prose is like crying, then you feel cry. So that is a prose and employs the heightened language or poetry. So the images, sounds, and feelings with more overt rhythm to the words. So those are the prose poems. Next is what are the responding to poetry and prose poems? Who is speaking? So you can ask, who is speaking of this poem? Next is where is the poem taking place? So that's the settings. So what are the image? When you read the poems, what kind of image that you read, that you observe? So what is the structure of this poem? What kind of structure that you can observe when you are reading that poem? What happens in the poem? What the story? I think if you read the story or when you read the poem in other prose, that uh, when you read it's like emotionally, like it's broken hearted, so you feel broken hearted. Another thing, what do you see in your mind's eyes, and what is feeling are evoked. What grounds in the poem emphasize the visuals, the feelings. So what gives the poem its energy, what makes you the reader interested in the poem. So those are the responding to poetry and prose poems. Okay, next is plays and screenplays. Okay, what is the difference between plays and screenplays? The difference in use of plays, meaning um, is the process of writing a screenplay is different from writing a play in many essential ways. The first is the difference in the use of action. For screenwriters, action is primary tool of structure. But for playwrights, the primary tool is dialogue. So what is the difference between plays and screenplays? Plays primarily focus on what you hear, while films tell a story but by what you see. When writing a screenplay, you a visual medium with no limitations except budget. So those are the meaning of plays and screenplays. Then in plays and screenplays, the design to be performed or filmed. So that is the structure of the plays. And another thing is storytelling in images. Short focus and intense relies on dialogue to tell the story of what is the dialogue, and you need to act, or what is the dialogue that perform or to characterize. Then there are two forms, plays and screenplays exist. What are those? Formative for readers and formative for entire theater company or movie production. It depends on what kind of uh, formative, so that the readers understand what they show, what they watch, what kind of plays the writing of the writers that we present. Okay, so the genres of creative writing are, there are different writings that you can write. The poetry, and those are the responding of plays and screenplays. What is the story of scene or act or play? So those are the character. And then the next question is, who talks? Who talks that film? Okay, what is the psychology of the person or people in the play? So what kind of uh, dialogue that you watch, that screenplays? And then what are the conflicts that come through in the dialogue? So what conflicts came from in the action one? What conflicts come through via the setting, and what changes over the course of the play? So there are a lot of questions that you can respond after you watch the story. Okay, what image do you see in your mind as you listen to the dialogue? So what is your observation after you read the dialogue? What are the images that you observe? So those are the responding to plays and screenplays. Then the graphic novels, comics, and experimental pieces. Graphic novel means a comic that works like a prose novel or novella. Another thing is combining both images and words to create a story. So those are the responding of to the graphic novels, comics, experimental pieces. What is work about, and what's the story the piece is telling? What emotions are covered in these pieces? Is the dialogue accurate, lively, and interesting? So if you are a writer, so what do you do if your reader are interesting to your pieces? Okay, what does each panel, section, line to do? What is different from others? What keeps interesting in reading this work? How does the artwork, including amplify the power of the story? So what does the experiment, including the ask of the reader, do is worth it? So those are the responding to graphic novels, comics, and experimental pieces. That will be all, and thank you for watching and listening. God bless.